Okay, now that we have the mint function completed, what we're going to do now is we're going to modify a pretty common function that you have no doubt seen, which is the token URI function, which again is another ERC 721 function that we are going to modify for our purposes. So we need to override it. And it's going to return a string. Okay, and then from here, we need to create a string that we'll call JSON, and we're going to invoke the Base64 library, which is going to encode a couple things. It's going to take the bytes. Well, it's gonna do this. It's going to cast the string that we get from the ABI into bytes into Base64. And I'm gonna explain all that in a bit. But essentially what we're looking at is you are going to use this function called ABI encode packed, which typically we use to concatenate strings. We're going to take all this, cast it to a string, cast it to bytes, and then we're going to invoke this Base64. And this is what we're going to use to return all this as a JSON format, and it looks like this. Okay, so let's write that out, what it's doing. So inside here, this is where our metadata goes. This is where we are going to encode the metadata. And then from here, we're just going to make sure it all works as a string, convert it to bytes, and then get our JSON. And this is what it's going to return, and this is what the blockchain is going to read. You read this function, or you use this function to get the particular token ID. And what a lot of people don't know is that when you trigger this function, the reason why it's public is because it allows other contracts to be able to read it, marketplaces to read it, and you can return whatever data that you want. And so by modifying and overriding the token URI function that ERC 721 gives us, we can do a lot of things, namely store on-chain metadata. So in order to do that, there are a few things that we need to do. We need to be able to convert some of these attributes that we created in the previous video, like the event access attribute and some of these Booleans that we have as well. We need a way to be able to access those and convert them. So let's go ahead and make some space here. And let's draw some of that out. So what we're going to do from here is we need to create some get functions. We need to create get functions for the image, and then also some of these Booleans. Okay, so this is going to be our section for our getter functions. And what the first one's going to look like is we're going to create this get image. It's going to accept a parameter. And again, it's going to cast using this ABI encode packed function. It's going to take the token URI. It's going to use this uint to string function that we have. And then it's going to concatenate all this. Concatenate again just means smush it all together and make it a string and return it. Cool, simple enough. Next thing is we need to do the same thing for our game access and our get reg A access. And a quick point about it being a string versus a Boolean and why we convert it. The reason why we're doing it this way is, remember, it's not really about it being a true Boolean, like a true or false thing. What we want to do is we want to take that actual Boolean. We have a missing parentheses there. We want to take that actual Boolean and we want to convert it to a string, because what we want to do is we want to change the actual JSON metadata. So everything has to be a string. And so that's basically why we have to take that, if that looks a little strange. Can access game. And this is the mapping that we created. And from there, G access equals true, else G access equals false. And then lastly, get reg A. One cool little activity while I'm typing this out you could do is for get reg A access, if I started you with this and said pause the video, you should be able to take what I did for get game access and do the same thing for reg A. So let's call it R access. And also, for those who are not aware, what this is it's truthy. So what that means is I don't have to write if this is true, if that was confusing to anyone, because it automatically assumes that, okay, if this is truthy, I could also do something like the opposite would be exclamation point, which would be the same as saying if that equals false, right? But because we want it to be true, it's just a nice little shorthand that I got used to using, just in case that was confusing. Our access, oops, false. Return our access. Okay, so now we have all of our getter functions in place. So the last thing that we want to do then is we're going to use these getter functions that we created in our token URI function. So what that looks like is if we go back here, I actually had that wrong. The here is metadata should have been inside here. And I think I have one too many, maybe, maybe not, we'll see. We'll see in a minute, I guess. Yeah, okay. So when you're doing this, be very, very careful, because what you're doing is you're mimicking JSON format. And so it's going to look a little bit weird. You have your brackets in this little parentheses thing, or not parentheses, you have your brackets in these single quotes. I guess what I'm saying is that you can get these double quotes and single quotes confused. But basically, for those who are familiar with JSON, this is how it look in JSON. So what the single quotes are saying is everything in here is going to be a string, and the string is going to look like this. It's going to have brackets, and then it's going to have something like this. Get image for that token ID. Comma. Okay. Now again, I know that looks pretty wonky. It has to be single quote, bracket, double quote, the image data. So image data can also be image, I believe, depending on what marketplace you're using, but image data will typically be read as this is where your URL for your token ID is going to go, or for your image. And then you want that in quotes as well, and that should be good. The next one is even trickier, because this is where you put in your attributes. So attributes is going to be surrounded by quotes again, and then you're going to have brackets, just like you would for the metadata. And then from there, we're going to use our uint to string. We're going to access our mapping. And then we're going to close it up. So this bracket matches that bracket. Next, we're going to add our traits. And if you want to cheat, let's just do that, because it can be complicated. Value, get game access. And then let's close up that bracket. And that should be it. Okay, so just a quick word to the wise. When it comes to using this token ID, if you have too many attributes, you are in danger of running the risk of getting this error called stack too deep. Typically, I run into this error when a parameter that I'm using, basically it's too deep. It's being used too many times, or it's showing up too far down in the function. Typically, if I have too many attributes, right? So right now it's pretty easy because we only have one attribute. But what typically tends to happen is, let's say instead of just this one attribute, or these three attributes rather, let's say we wanted to add something like 10 or 11 or 12. What's going to happen is every time this token ID variable is called, eventually you're going to hit a limit. One of the ways around that is if I were to take that and create a new variable for it. If it was, ID equals token ID. And sometimes that actually helps. Don't know why, but if you run into the error because your token URI functions getting too complex, typically when I write functions that are that large, sometimes I do run into the stack too deep error. So it's just a quick heads up if it helps anybody.